Welcome to our very first On Ed Mentors Live. On Ed Mentors is a part of the Mentory where we are committed to our goal of supporting teachers through mentorship to ensure that they have professional learning opportunities, ways to find well-being, and build efficacy through supportive mentorship. I'm really excited to continue a conversation we had on Ed Mentors a few months back, and this is about teaching history with a modern lens. I'm so excited that we have Samantha Kuchar here on the show to talk a little bit about her endeavors and the video experience that we're going to try to capture for her and with her. So welcome back, Samantha. Please introduce what it is that you're doing.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Samantha Cutrera. I'm the Principal Storytelling Officer for our new history video series called Histoire Source Story. It's a video series and podcast for usually Canadian history teachers, but we also focus on a wide variety of transnational histories where we introduce sources and we talk about how they can challenge the traditional narratives that we normally teach in the classroom. And I'm so excited to partner with you on this because everyone will be able to see this video on our YouTube channel. And I think it's such a wonderful opportunity to bring these conversations together. So thank you so much for hosting us, Noah.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. The show is a great way to gather a wonderful panel of educators. And while we build a new panel each week, each panel becomes kind of like a community unto itself. So I'm really happy that we have some of the original cast of that panel here tonight. And I'm going to begin with welcoming Selena. So Selena, welcome back to the conversation and welcome to this platform.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here and happy to represent Louisiana and Lab Education, my organization. So pleased to be back.
Tell us a little bit about Lab Education.
Yeah, so Lab Education is an organization created by teachers for teachers. And it's really our mission just to empower educators to challenge bias and embrace diversity. We realize that how challenging it could be to do the work. And then sometimes it's really hard to do it when you don't know where to start. And so we really like to provide that support and that community and help teachers develop that support in that community for themselves wherever they are. So I'm really excited to be here and extend my community with you guys and, supporting me in my journey as well. So I'm excited about it.
Well, thank you again for being here. And Garfield Jeannie Newman, who's also back. Welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thanks so much. Glad to be back and looking forward to continuing the fascinating conversation we began and looking forward to continuing to explore ways that history becomes, a subject of the future, not the past, one of prospective thinking and building the kind of world we want to live in.
And so much of that world has artifacts that we tell stories about. And that's really, the impetus of what Samantha is gathering through this video series. And it's really interesting to take our conversation and weave it through the idea of a source. We know that sources can come from anywhere, and how we choose and curate the sources and resources that we use in the classroom can also be a story unto itself. So I want to take us back to the questions that we were looking at. And I want to begin with, what were some of your takeaways from that first episode where we were together talking about teaching history in today's world?
I mean, I can kick it off and say that my first thought when I read that question was like, there's a lot of work to be done for folks to really see the importance of inquiry, and looking at history is not something to be memorized, but to be analyzed and, evaluated and, reflect upon. And right now, at least in my community, I'm not seeing as much of that as I would like. And so that's just, that piece stands out. I think recently, Louisiana, we just approved of our new social studies standards, and they're not moving in the right direction, and they're very vague, and they're stepping away from inquiry. And so it's a concern. How are we going to move educators to that conversation where the standard may not even encourage it as much as we would like,
Yeah.
So like I did a Google search of all of the standards of the words, like inquiry is not even there. And I was like, okay, good start. So it's, it just made me realize how much growth we need to have. And that's also like with myself. And so I don't know, it was a really enlightening conversation for sure.
Yeah, it was enlightening for me too. Garfield?
Yeah, Selena, I wanted to tell you it's interesting in a sad way that here in Canada, Alberta's going in a similar direction with a curriculum that's really taking steps backwards. The good news, I think, is I've been really enjoying working with teachers to find ways that you can embed quality thinking, forward thinking, despite what the curriculum says. So that's not to say we ignore the curriculum. It will be addressed. It will be done the way it's required, but it doesn't mean we have to give up on deep, thoughtful learning. And it's just helping teachers frame things to say, look, I'll help you meet the curriculum, but let's not go backwards. And so it's interesting to hear you're having a similar, it's a challenge for us. But, I was going to say, if we make this a routine part of learning, it will get entrenched in ways that curriculum can't stop us because it just becomes the way learning happens.
I think that that's really important. And that was my really big takeaway is this wasn't a conversation about the subject of history. This was really about teaching. And I think everybody could connect to it. Samantha, you're agreeing. What did you want to add?
Well, there were two big takeaways I took from last time we all spoke, which is why it was really exciting to come back together. The first one was the fact that Zach, who we're missing today, was an English teacher, and Selena is from Louisiana, and Garfield and I have similar Canadian history backgrounds. But the fact is that we could all have this conversation, and it really demonstrated the kind of interdisciplinary, transnational ways that we can continue this conversation because, as Garfield said the last time that we spoke, like there have been a lot of changes, but there also hasn't been a lot of changes. And so that means that we can never think that we're going to get to a place where the work is complete. It's more about how we can continue on our journey together to make sure that we are still going in a direction that we feel like is best for our students and their futures, in a way that could to have a more transformative future, which is why we all came together in that first meeting.
Yeah, but also to be able to make meaning from what the past tells us and what the trajectory it sends us on. I think a lot of the time meaning is made for us, and this whole pendulum swing, we'll call it, of going back to certain beliefs that had evolved and are now devolving, I'm going to say, when it comes to certain texts being able to be used, or it comes to laws about what can be done in the classroom and not done in the classroom. I think it's our job as educators to stay apprised, to know what we know and believe what we believe, and still uphold all of the standards that we are responsible for, but really uphold the future of our learners and keeping those skills in view in whatever we're doing. And so let's start to get into the conversation about the skills that we're going to be talking about, to also be looking at how we can use sources and a story to help build the critical thinking skills that students need in the history classroom and really across all of their learning.
Well, I'll just kick it off. I mean, what's so great about our video series is that we've gotten to see so many different types of sources, from newsletters. We also, in 2020, we looked at audio recordings of seances, which was very interesting, because what they all do is that they introduce different ways of understanding or a different glimpse into the past. And that's been really exciting to be able to have those conversations, because even though I wind up introducing people as historians, like this year's series, I'm talking with anthropologists and sociologists and photographers, and I find myself being drawn to these interdisciplinary people, and in particular, people that are talking about things that are artistic and creative. So I did bring a source to show like a book like this, right? Encounter, for example, is such a great way to talk about different narratives in history, but then also use it as an example of how students can create their own meaning through an assessment that's like creating a picture book, for example, because those types of active critical thinking, meaning making, and do that through art is such a special way to tap into a different type of story that the students want to hear about history themselves, not to rewrite the past, but to write the past in a way that gives homage to the different stories that we don't always have records for.
What's interesting about that book in particular is she says this is an imagined past,
Yeah.
as if Indigenous people were seen as equals and traded stories and learning in a way that actually helped each of them, not in a utilitarian way, but in a way that was mutually respectful. And she gives a caveat in that, I think it's the back pages, that she talks about why this is imagined and what really happened with Jacques Cartier. And so it can bring in whatever it is you're learning, but also allow students to wonder, yes, it's exactly, to really wonder and think about why that imagination was necessary, what are the ramifications of that first encounter, and how could it have been different. So I think, yeah.
And Dr. Brittany Louie, who is the writer of that storybook, is also a history professor that works in dams and water maintenance and all these other elements. And it's so interesting that this is such an important vehicle for her to work with community and to be able to share her knowledge. It's really exciting.
That makes me think about his first name is escaping me right now, but Dr. Kazembe, we were talking about history and teaching it and making sure, we don't forget it in order to, move forward and, prosper. But he said art is an acronym, a revolutionary tool. And when I know that's why I was fumbling through my notebook. I was like, where is it? What did he say? So, but it's so true. Like using it as a lens, like you said, like that art to really look at, okay, what do we see from history? What are we not seeing from what we're told? And challenging them to even create their own based off of what they learn or explore or wonder. So, I love that. I think I agree. Art is an excellent tool, no matter the medium, to explore or, express themselves. Yeah.
I have to say, I think much of this conversation, I think, delightfully challenges a couple of long-standing Western assumptions. And one is, and this is I'm learning from studying two-eyed seeing, that in the West we see knowledge as a noun, something to be transferred, handed over, and therefore memorized. In Indigenous cultures, knowledge is a verb. And that completely changes. Knowledge is constructed. It is worked together. I mean, that's what knowledge keepers. They don't hand over. You construct. You build meaning. Knowledge is constructed, and it's ongoing. And Samantha used a phrase earlier that reminded me of this: the journey. It doesn't end, because it's not you're handing something over. It's an endless journey we're on. And the second piece that fascinates me, and especially with the source story, Samantha, your background, in Western academics, the essay is the be-all and end-all, and it is an argumentative approach, whereas storytelling is an explanatory approach. It's a very different approach, and I think it excites students, and it allows us to engage students in history in ways that has just been so narrowly defined for so many years, that the essay is the measure, when in fact curating, curatorial thinking, storytelling, these are powerful explanatory, but again, understanding they are not argumentative in nature. They're not taking a position and defending it against the other side. And I think this holds such promise for really engaging students and young people in knowing the past.
I hope that you listened to a previous On Ed Mentors, because we deconstructed this almighty essay, and all of the panelists had so much insight, really looking at not to take away the essay, to understand what it is and not use it only, or to use a multimodal approach when building the criteria for what the essay will be, so that it's not essay writing over essay writing, and not this what really very Western infused idea of how conversation should be supported with examples. There's nothing wrong with it, but for it to be the sole construct or the sole product in a course is really limiting, especially because it happens across subject areas and there's so much more we can do and really build. I'm so happy that you mentioned it, and I hope you check out that On Ed Mentors episode.
Didn't you also have a recent On Ed Mentors about creativity?
Yes, we did. That was last week's Tools for Creativity. We have some fantastic shows. What can I tell you? Really lucky.
It's interesting about like the almighty essay or the argumentative approach, because I know that there are standards and curriculum expectations that do include that. And one of the things that I've done in creating some work on digital humanities that was meant for undergrad work, but it can work for K-12 as well, is to do an essay as an exhibit and use that exhibit like as PowerPoint slides, which you can even animate, which then becomes a digital story. Because then what you're doing is, sure, you need to have an argument and prove it with evidence, but think about all the multimodal elements of evidence and what we can do with all those different pieces when we think about it's not just proving that you're right, but also showing the different dimensions of how you are constructing this understanding of a particular topic.
Yes, and if you follow, I just Angela Stockman. Sorry, I don't know what just happened to me. If you follow Angela Stockman, every Sunday she talks about how she's teaching essay writing in this very multimodal way, and they're doing video essays, and it's really interesting to see what's possible. And that's what's so powerful about these conversations is so often, we are siloed or confined to our spaces and the contexts in which we teach or work. And it's really important that these conversations become ways for us to think differently. And it's the same with learners. If you don't expose them to different sources and different people and different ideas, then they're not constructing meaning. They're just being downloaded information. And that's been the challenge with history for so long. So let's get back into some of those sources that you guys brought with you tonight. So Selena, what did you want to speak about?
Yeah, so I shared, I think I told you guys last episode that I was a self-made history teacher. I taught, I was asked over the summer, hey, we need someone to teach this course. I know you teach English, but teach African American studies. So I had to do a lot of homework myself. And so one of the things that I have found helpful, and I don't have the title right now, but I'll find it later, is the Smithsonian African American History Museum. They have a book that was my like ultimate textbook, and it went through the entire narrative. And I understand that there's so much more instead of just one book. But I use that as my start to then investigate or explore, and even invite my students to research and explore and discover more than what we were learning just from that text. Another big one was PBS. They produced some fantastic videos about hip hop and like the history of hip hop and like what to learn about it, because it is now, I would say, beginning to be appreciated art, but definitely underappreciated over the years. And it talks about just how they have like different beats and the art behind it, and like rapping on beat versus off beat, and none of these things were discussed. You just had to know of them. And now we're starting to see sources that appreciate art such as that. And so that's an excellent source. Like the videos are fantastic. And I think I had another source for sure. Oh, how could I forget? Teaching. Nope, that's not their name anymore. Learning for Justice. Fantastic source. They are great for English teachers, social studies teachers, whatever it is. Excellent source for trying to just navigate some of the conversations, or to just learn more yourself, or to find a library of text to teach if you're trying to provide more diversity in your text or show more narratives there. That is an excellent source right there if you want to write one down. But that has helped me in my self-made history days. Those three texts are definitely, or those three sources were top notch for me and helped me survive that year. Because that's what I needed to do, was survive.
And sometimes that's all we have in education is we are, minute to minute, class to class, learning ahead of them and trying to maintain, that engagement and meaning for ourselves as well as our learners. Samantha, did you want to probe the sources that Selena mentioned?
Well, I wanted to highlight an example of a hip hop song, which, as I said, hip hop song. You'll hear in the video that in the original video that I fumble through. I'm like, is it a song? Is it a different? Anyway, so I wanted to know if you had any examples, Selena, because in 2020 I talked with Dr. Francesca Amicio Cuthbert about a Canadian rapper, and one of his songs from the 1980s, and we talked about how it can be used as like an assessment piece if students want to write their own rap, but then also a piece of history from the 1980s because it talks about all these like contemporary issues. So I don't know if in those PBS videos there was a particular song or piece of music that you kind of were drawn to, because in the Canadian example, we do have a history of hip hop, but it's not quite the same as the American history. So that's why it was really exciting to focus on an American, a Canadian rapper. And there's also a really great rap about Africville, which was a community in Nova Scotia that was demolished in the 1980s. It was a Black settlement, 1960s, sorry. And we also use that quite a lot for teaching. So yeah, I don't want to put you on the spot, Selena, but if you if you used anything, it would be really interesting.
I was trying to find it. I don't have the songs on the top of my head, but like I know they talked about what is it? Oh, of course, they're just like leaving my mind right now. But like they talked about Gucci Man and T.I. and who else? They talked about like one video I pulled it up is like who invented trap music, which is like that's always been the music that like no one wants you to hear, talking about like parents and whatnot, like, oh, you need to stop listening to that, and like seeing them like appreciate it for what it is, as like we talked about, a revolutionary tool. Is pretty cool. And I'm trying to think of Andre 3000. Who is he with? Why is that
Big Boy?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Why couldn't I say that? But yeah, some of the one of their songs, and they really broke it down. Y'all, you have got to see the video. Like they had the lyrics up and they showed the beat and how they're rapping off the beat. I think it might have been I don't know. I'm trying to remember the song, but it's so good. Go, definitely worth checking out. I'll find the links and share it right now.
Well, while you're finding the links, I'm just going to say I have a Building Outside the Blocks project called History Beats, and it's been amazing whether you use it in English class or history class. When I was teaching individuals and societies in grade 7, History Beats was one of my favorite parts of the day, because not only would students take a song that has a historical element and really critically determine to what degree it was accurate, but look at multiple sources in order to say why it was a powerful song for history teaching or not. And so there was a lot of analysis in it, but the songs we get to hear and the joy in the classroom, like, okay, dude, who's doing what for History Beats today? It is so fun and exciting. So there's lots of ways to infuse your class with music, and music, like you were saying, is a powerful source and a powerful art form for expression and capturing things from the past. And whether you're looking at like the Railroad trilogy, or you're looking at things that are a little bit harder, like Buffalo Soldier, things that you might take for granted because you're rocking a Bob Marley and you're like, oh my God, Buffalo Soldiers were real. This was a real thing. And long before, anyway, without going into specific songs and music, I've blogged about it, but music is a great source for history work. Thank you so much for talking about that. And we'll come back to you guys, but I want to get to Garfield to talk about the source that you're bringing tonight.
Okay, well, I had a list, so I'll try to mention a couple, and then just cut me off at any point. But I'm going to preface, Noah, if you don't mind, by a small tweak to some language that used, and that is, we often see critical thinking referred to as a skill, a critical thinking skill. And I would encourage us to move past that, because skills are smaller, bite-sized pieces. Critical thinking is a competency. More important, it's a methodology. And that's going to underpin everything I say here, in that once we really understand critical thinking, it underpins everything we do. My worry about it being a skill is it becomes one of several get checked off. Okay, we've mastered critical thinking skills. Now we can move on. And everything I'm going to talk about will say, no, critical thinking is the method. It's the pedagogical approach I use. It's bigger. So that's my context. I'm going to be a wee bit of a rebel and say, what's the source? I want just to think about any textbook. And my note is that textbooks, I think, are misused and abused. There are problems with textbooks, but that's the opportunity. And I think that's what's missed. I see many teachers who will say, well, I don't use a textbook for whatever. And I say, but textbooks are my opportunity to have students look at, what do they get right? You want to decolonize the curriculum. Let's go into the text and see what narrative's being pushed and then wonder and challenge it. Let's take a look at a 1970s text, a 1990s text, and a current text. How have things evolved? How have things changed? What hasn't changed? I think textbooks are a rich source if we use them to inquire into, not to consume. And that to me is an important. So I'm pushing there not a source really as much as a pedagogy. Use any source to question it, to wonder about it. If you don't mind, I'm going to add on a couple of others. Popular film. I think popular film is a rich source, again, for kids to question. So I don't care how bad we think the history is. I would argue it's not my job to decide. And what always troubles me is when teachers themselves decide this film is worthy of showing or this one is not, and I won't show it. That's a student opportunity. Does this film present a bias? Does it present accurate history? Those are wonderful opportunities for students. I'm going to say one more piece. I have other sources, but I want to add one more into the music piece, like the opposite end. I listed Stan Rogers. And if any of you do not know Stan Rogers, sadly, 40 years ago, Stan died in a fire on the tarmac, I believe, in Cincinnati, a fire on an airplane. Very sad. But Stan Rogers was a master storyteller, and he told stories. One of my favorite is McDonald at the Heights, in which he tells the story of the bugler who also died alongside General Brock, but his story is not told. He goes on to say only 1 in 10,000 know his name. He tells the story of what the Italians call the popolo minuto, or the little people that are often not referred to in history. And again, what a rich source to mine Stan Rogers' music and his lyrics and as a storyteller for history. And there are many more people like that, but Stan's no longer with us, and I think he is a superb source. I'll stop there. I'll add a few more maybe later in the conversation, but hopefully that'll get us started.
First of all, I want to thank you for respectfully reframing my word choice. And I think it is important very often, especially when we're assessing. And that was my big worry when the competencies were supposed to be evaluated, which got moved because of the pandemic. But those competencies are transferable, and they're essential, and they're always evolving. And so you're right. I understand now from what you're saying that skill implies an end. And I think that a competency has a continuum that you're always moving on, hopefully. So I appreciate that. And the whole Stan Rogers thing got me thinking of what a cool activity to talk about some of the little people in history and have their point of view. Like I have 100 ideas for just that idea. So thank you for that. I'm happy to talk about a source. I didn't want to be the person to do that, but if you're interested, Samantha, let me know.
Yeah, I would love to hear your source, but I also want to add a quick comment from Garfield, from what Garfield had said about like using a textbook, because I too really encourage teachers to start using a textbook to frame out a historic space. Like, what are the elements we're supposed to learn in order to then challenge it? But what I really wanted to say that in bringing up a textbook as a source to use is that the language right now really focuses on bringing primary sources into the classroom, which is great. I have no problem with that. But actually, it sets up this false binary between primary and secondary sources, because the only thing that makes a source primary is the questions that we ask of it. And the only thing that makes a source secondary are the questions we ask of it. So we can use a textbook, a contemporary textbook, as a secondary source, or if we are using as a primary source, ask the questions that I think Garfield was moving towards, which was like, how do people in 2020 frame this historical event? And I think that, when I worked at the Archives of Ontario and I asked students to think of like primary sources, sometimes students would say the Bible. And it was an interesting one because in some classes, that was a primary source to them, and in other classes it wasn't. And I think students really like that kind of complexity. So I just want to like echo off using popular movies and textbooks because they can also be primary sources depending on how we ask questions of them. And I think that's what's really exciting about coming in by thinking of these different materials to ask questions about and with.
I think that that's really interesting. So now I'm wondering, I was going to talk about currency because I love to use,
Ooh.
especially dollar bills. I usually use the Viola Desmond dollar bill, the $10 bill, to talk about her. But there's so much richness on that particular bill that the students inquire about all of the different icons and what it means and why she was chosen. So I'm wondering, would you call it a primary or a secondary source? Because it has images that are secondary, but as one piece, is it not primary?
I would say if you're asking questions about it, it becomes a primary source. I don't know. What do other people think?
Well, I think an interest, Peter Satius, now retired at UBC, he suggests that we not use primary and secondary, but instead we use traces and accounts, which I really like. Like a post hole stain is a trace of the past. A textbook is an account, which I love, Samantha, the way you framed it. It is an account, and that account can be primary or secondary, but it's someone's construction of the past. I would say that that currency is an account. It's been assembled by someone. And at some point in the future, we may see it as primary or secondary, but it's an account of the past. It was constructed. And I really liked when he suggested traces and accounts because it fits so nicely with story and artifacts. Did someone construct this? Or is this something left behind by our presence? And I thought, interesting twist on primary and secondary. And Samantha, I so agree with you. You take a look at a textbook of the 50s. That, if I'm looking at Cold War perceptions, that is most definitely a primary source. This is how kids are being taught at the time. On the other hand, it was constructed as. So I love that framing. It's the question we ask that determines how it's being used. And I don't think we do that nuance with kids enough. I think we try to make it very black and white, and I don't think it at all is.
Well, I think we do to make it attainable as opposed to deciding that they can be complex too. We don't need to feed them things that they can construct meaning on their own. But that requires a massive shift for so many. So let's go back to the sources, because that makes me think that the $2 bill I pulled out to show my daughters what it looks like and feels like, that's then primary in my conversation because it's an artifact from the past. But when we're deconstructing the images on a bill, then that I'm attributing an account to it. Wow, this is fantastic.
But I would say that everything is constructed, and like when you think of like the American currency, for example, when they were going to take Hamilton off the $10 bill and put Harriet Tubman on, but then Hamilton the musical is very popular. People were like, no, we like him right now. And then Andrew Jackson, who is a mass murderer and looks like the creepy guy in The Bodyguard. like people want to keep him on at this particular moment, and then Harriet, like those narratives too are so rich to get people talking. So I love the idea of currency.
Well, it really, there's so much in each bill, but in the US for sure, like I know the very first time I ever really looked at the bill, I had so many questions, and it did drive me to learning more about American history. So those are things that I think we take for granted that are in our everyday lives that are full of historical conversations if we choose to use them as catalysts.
Yeah, I would agree. And I love the just kind of going back a little bit about just the whole idea of like always providing questions and like never letting one source be the end of that search. You know what I mean? Like this is just another piece here to continue to explore. Right now I'm thinking, so I'm a master teacher at my local high school, and so I support other teachers and I support ELA teachers and I support social studies teachers. And one of the challenges is like, we were talking about students being kind of black and white, but also teachers and feeling like they also want to check things off. Taught that, check it, move on. But like this ongoing inquiry is not something you ever check. You know what I mean? It's that I like the way you phrased it, Garfield. It was, you said not a skill. It was like a practice, or how did you phrase it?
It's a methodology or an approach.
Yes. Okay. Yes. but that's not something you check off. So as I'm thinking, like, as support for my teachers, like, how do we get them into that practice? Because, people want to feel like they're accomplished and they're like, yes, we did it. So you don't want them to feel like they never made it, but the practice is making it. So, like, I don't know. It's just that weird paradox of, like, you're doing it, but you're not doing it. You're always doing it. So I don't know. Just maybe if you guys have any ideas there, I would love to hear.
Well, Celine, I'm going to throw something, if it's okay. No, I'm going to just throw something in very quickly. That's it's a different night topic, and it's around assessment. Mm-hmm. But I would suggest to you that too often in schools, we use assessments as proof of learning. Now that I've transmitted this body of information to you, here's a task for you to complete, and that will provide evidence that you've met the state outcome or provincial curriculum. It's a proof of learning model. And I think we have to flip this on its head and say, no, my questions are invitations to learn. They're not proof of learning. And so they launch the learning and we will explore it. But I think we do far too much front-end loading of stuff and then say, now prove you've learned by write an essay, write a test, do a project, whatever it is. So until we flip that around and genuinely invite kids into learning that matters and stop front-end loading, we won't get there.
Well, that goes back to our point about this conversation being essentially pedagogical as opposed to it being specifically for history. And there's a lot of evolution that teachers need to have because they need to see that there's freedom, even within the confines of standards and curriculum, but also because our learners are living in a complicated world, inundated by lots of things that they need to question, that they need to not take for face value, and they certainly need to think before they share. So I think that this conversation is a reflection of how complex it is and how I think just like students are like, just tell me the answer. Teachers will say, just tell me the answer. What do I do? Give me a box to check because I have 1,000 boxes and more every day. But somehow our work has to be both reprieve and guidance in how to manage all of that and that competing reality that so many of us live every day.
So in my book, Transforming the Canadian History Classroom, although it could work for American history classrooms too, one of the chapters says like that to create spaces of meaningful learning for students, schools have to be places for meaningful teaching for teachers. And that so often teachers are working in contexts, especially over the last 2 years, that don't honor and value and see the work that they do. And so then, you call it in because you're burnt out. Like, I totally get it. And I said that like you need time, space, and place for reflection, for venting, not bitching, the way some of the teachers would be like, oh, when I go to the staff room, I'm just bitching. But this is like a reflective conversation, and for research, because not just research, but like processing the information to like get it into your consciousness. And this kind of time, space, and place, for me, one of the recommendations was like for teachers to not think they have to be the experts in everything, but to always come into the classroom being like, this is a community, I'm facilitating the community and facilitating the conversation, but I don't have to be the bearer of all the knowledge, because to link with what Garfield's saying, because then assessment is only to just like check that, because we only then create those dynamics. So to be like, let's just kind of explore this together. I don't have to be the expert, I think can take some pressure off teachers, but it is a really hard context that everyone is working in right now. And that I think it's going to be really important for everyone to think about how to rebuild heavier more spaces of healing for teachers and students. And when I say everyone, I mean like society at large, individual teachers, departments, principals, superintendents, etc.
Well, that's some of the beautiful work that we're doing here at the Mentory, is creating time, place, and space for everybody. So whether it's by offering a one-to-one self-directed mentorship experience where there's no hierarchy and you can actually say, I want to learn this and this is who I want to learn it from, and you can make that happen for yourself with no shelf life. Or it's a circle conversation where somebody's there, and as opposed to just being a vent session, it's more of a directional vent where you're guided out to do something, or Impact, where you actually go through a 3-part change. So we work really hard to do exactly that, to create spaces, to offer times, and to find lots of different ways for people to self-direct mentorship for learning. Because the other part of what you're illustrating is we wait to be told what we need to do because we're being evaluated or assessed by other people who have their own, sometimes linear ideas about what teaching and learning is about. So it's on us to self-direct our learning the way we know, to fill in our own gaps. And with every bit of learning, you realize just how much you don't know, and you just go one step further. So hopefully it's a positive experience, because if it's not, this is not the job for you. You got a long, long way to go.
Yeah.
But to think of those things that you don't know as like really exciting rather than really fearful. And I didn't mean to like lob that promotional ball your way, but I'm really glad I did by mistake, because the mentoring is such a great place for teachers, especially in Ontario, that are already kind of part of those conversations and working in similar contexts to happen.
Yeah, but we're boardless and borderless. So that's why I can have anybody I want on the show, and anybody can come from anywhere, because so much of our educational world isn't a contextual thing, right? There are things that are universal, and there are aspects to teaching that we can benefit from hearing from people from different countries and learning with each other. So yes, Ontario, and yes, beyond. And that's the really exciting part about On Ed Mentors and this very first live show, because it's about mentorship on your side and at your time whenever you need it most. So whether you listen live or you catch it on the replay, it's good to be able to have things at your fingertips. But what I really want to do to close out this conversation, so people can have this idea on their fingertips, is how can we create truly transformative history classes? Garfield?
Sure. One of the things I've become intrigued with in the last couple of years is the notion of prospective thinking. Prospective thinking, P-R-O-spective, is future-oriented thinking. And when you start playing with how we frame historical questions with a prospective lens, it's quite fascinating. So for me, it's been a bit of an evolution of, how do I take curriculum expectations, historical content, and problematize it? And so there's a critical thinking lens. So for example, I might take a leader from the past and ask, was this person an effective leader? That's a critical thinking question. And I could build criteria for an effective leader, and kids would assemble evidence, and they'd have to make a case why they were or were not an effective leader. And that's all good critical thinking. But when I add a prospective twist, my question becomes something like, is person X someone we should aspire to be like? Oh, so now I'm looking at the past. I'm looking at history to say, what mistakes have we made that we want to avoid going forward? Or what can we learn from the past to take forward with us? Not just to critique the past or to judge people in the past, but to say, what are the lessons to be learned to build the future we want? And I've really been intrigued by, going into text, going into questions that we ask in history and say, but what if I reframe that so that it's not about, that's why I began tonight saying, what's exciting me about these conversations is reinforcing the idea that history is primarily a subject about the future, not about the past. It's about how the past informs the future and helps us shape the future. But that's where its real value lies. And I'm afraid for too many students, they don't see that because it's taught to them as stuff in the past that they don't see relevance to. So I think if we want history to be transformative, it needs to connect to the world the kids are living in and helping to create as we go forward.
It reminds me of this quote by Henry Glassy, that history is not the past, but a map of the past drawn from a particular point of view to be useful to the modern traveler.
Beautiful.
So, thank you for that. That was
That's
fantastic.
great.
Samantha?
So, transformative history. So, I think that history is transformative when students understand themselves within it in a way that can move them into the future. Here's the word future again, in really positive ways. I see history education as a form of activism, and to be able to help students understand themselves with a lot more complexity so that they understand themselves as agents of change as well. I have a cat here. And so to be able to do that is really to open up space for challenge, for dialogue, for connection and complexity, and to really, as a history teacher or as a teacher that talks about history, even if it's in a different context, to like really think about what your purpose is, how you understand your purpose, and then the ways that you achieve that or don't achieve that, because I think that helps us like deconstruct our own ideas when we're coming into the classroom in order to open up more space for students' ideas to grow and take shape. So that's my not so short answer.
But it's a beautiful answer because it reminds
Thanks.
us that learning isn't separate from us. It is us. And if it doesn't include us, then it can't really be learning, because learning is about a permanent change. And we're the ones who have to go through it. So I think that that is quite profound. Selena, how would you transform the history classroom?
Two things that came to mind that were questions, asking questions, and making connections. And both of you guys have already said that already. And just never taking that one source, primary, secondary, trace account, whatever's one, but not letting it be the end of that discovery, but just being the next step, right? And then finding the step after that, and then making connections. I agree with Samantha that we need to constantly connect, because history is nothing in my head, not to oversimplify, but humans dealing with problems from long ago. So what we're doing, we're humans right now dealing with problems right now. And so there are a lot of things we can connect to. And I think if we help, students see those connections thematically, at least, that we'll be able to, put our eyes on the future and use that as a map to move forward. So connections and questions would be my answer.
What a beautiful way to connect this entire conversation. I'm so grateful to all of you for this time, for sharing the sources that you use, that you think about, and that you bring into your classrooms. I hope that this show is a source for people to learn, but to listen and to grow from each other. We are live every single week on Thursday from 9 to 10 on Voice Ed Radio. But this is a unique thing. I'm so grateful to you, Samantha, for even giving me the idea to put this on video. We've never done this before. So this is history in the making. You saw it here. Does anybody want to say anything as we close out tonight's event?
Well, I want to thank all of you, especially you, Noah. I don't know why I keep pointing the wrong way, because I think questions and connections is such a great way to end this conversation as well. Because even though like Selena is in Louisiana, like these are questions and connections that we should be having across borders, right? So by saying that your work is borderless, I think that's such a great way to think of these conversations, and I'm excited to like continue them, even if it's over Twitter. So thank you.
Okay, well, anybody want to say anything before I play you out?
Yeah, I just want to say how awesome all of you guys are, and that lab education, we're actually going to start a new podcast this summer called Tell About a Time, where it's all about storytelling, and we're inviting guests to share stories about themselves. And look, all of y'all are invited. You will be hearing from me. So, and it's just another, it just really this conversation really enforces the need for that, to share stories and connect with each other. So thank you for sharing your stories and your knowledge and all of that good stuff. So I really appreciate it. And I can't wait to have you on the podcast, because I'm going to have you on the podcast.
Selena, I want to return the invitation, perhaps, in that over the past couple of years, I've been doing some global inquiries with children in countries around the world who come together. And that's been mostly primary, and we've been looking at a variety of seasons and so on. But I want to elevate these into middle and high school and look at important issues where kids around the world use technology to have conversations like we're having and share their stories and be the agents of change. So it'd be a great start just getting Louisiana and my students, and I work with schools in China and Korea that would get on board, and Peru, and we could put together an amazing, 6-week kind of exploration using some format. I don't know it, but you've got me thinking.
I'm down for the journey.
You heard it here first, ladies and gentlemen.
Down
Thanks
for the
another
journey.
wonderful conversation. Thank you for elevating this conversation by being very, very specific. We hope that you tune into the first part of this conversation where Zach was. I want to give a special thank you to Christine Chin, who's my partner on the leadership team at the Mentry, and behind the scenes here tonight. All of us at the Mentry are so grateful that On Ed Mentors is our voice out and our way in to make sure that we're truly responsive to educators. And I want to thank all of you for your time. Have a fantastic evening, everybody.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. See you soon, I hope.